All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the May 12th, 2021 regular Budget Review Committee meeting. I call this meeting to order. And now I will call the roll. Pepin is here. McKeon? DeHoff? Here. Carruthers? Here. And Vigneault? Here. Great. First, we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. Danielle, would you like to do the Pledge of Allegiance? Great.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right, in accordance with state law, we're going into public comment here. An item not scheduled on the agenda may be brought forward by the general public for comment. However, the committee members will not be able to discuss or take action on any issue not included on the agenda. You may speak up to 3 minutes. Speakers have one opportunity to address the committee during public comment. If you're on the phone and you wish to speak on this item, please press *9 now. Once it's time, the city clerk will unmute you in the order received. As a reminder to those calling in, when speaking, please remember to keep some distance from your microphone so that those who are watching at home are able to hear you clearly. Do we have any public speakers?
No.
Great, thank you. That concludes public comment. Next on our agenda are staff items. First item is the approval of the May 5th, 2021 regular Budget Review Committee meeting minutes. If you're on the phone and you wish to speak on this item, please press *9 now. Once it's time, the city clerk will call you in the order received. Do we have any speakers on this item?
No.
Okay, that concludes the speakers. And time for committee discussion. We can discuss, and if we have a motion, we'll entertain that now.
I move we accept the minutes.
Great, we have a motion.
Second that.
And a second. Do I call that out, or do you have that for the minutes? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
That is unanimous. Item number 2, discussion of fiscal year 2021 through 2022 operating budget and capital improvement program. If you're on the phone and you wish to speak on the item, please press *9 now. Once it's time, the clerk will call you in the order received. City Clerk, do we have any speakers on this item?
No.
All right, that concludes that. All right, at this point, staff, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is really structured as a way to have a conversation between the BRC and staff members. So I have the proposed operating budget that we could put up on screen if we need it as a reference, but really this time is geared towards, answering any questions that the BRC may have based on their review of the budget. So there's no formal presentation for this portion.
Okay, thank you. Well then, for this, should we address kind of the process and the memo and that at this point, or just want to open it up for general discussion?
I think, we can just open it up for general discussion. Maybe we can rotate amongst the BRC members and give them a chance to ask questions that they might have.
Okay.
Or, state observations or provide suggestions for improvement.
Okay, then we'll do that now. So this will be a time committee for questions and comments and all that. And then the next item, we'll kind of focus on the memo itself and how we're going to structure our recommendations, if that sounds good to everyone. So, all right, go ahead and raise your hand if you want me to call on you for, or we can just process through. So would you like to go first, Danielle?
Not particularly.
Okay, would anyone like to go first and dive in here with some questions? All right, Peter.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, nobody closer. Okay. Sorry. I have the old mic. All right. Hopefully you can all hear me. So I do have actually some questions about the water system and that part of the budget. So under the public, I'm sorry. Well, under that section of the budget, we have something called utilities, and if I read this right, The utilities for the water services. Oh, am I off? Sorry, just got to get the microphone really close. Okay, that's fine. Maybe I can hold it. Yeah. All right, excellent. So under water utility funds, we have and the sewer, we have something like $800,000 in utilities costs, and I was wondering, is that basically power to move the water around and to move sewage around to do that?
Are you looking at the individual department pages?
Yes. I'm going to see if I can find it in this particular one. Give me a moment. Here we go. No, it's under Development Services, Public Works. There we go. So if we, on overall, you know, the Public Works Department is about 1.8 million, but when I was going through it, that's for utilities. When I was going through it, I saw under like the water treatment, water supply, treatment, and storage, utilities were about 734.
Yep, there it is right there
then-
on the screen.
Oh, is that where? Oh, yeah, I can see that. Excellent. And then you have, you know, relatively small numbers. Wastewater's a little 80 grand, and then I think in there's this other section, parks and trails. They have actually the next highest utilities cost. But in terms of the place for the drinking water and the wastewater, are those utilities? Is that basically encompassed by like the energy costs to move things around?
Yes, the majority of those costs are going to be for things like pump stations on the water side and lift stations on the wastewater side. And yes, both of those are moving their respective assets through the system.
Okay, so has the city given given thought to capital expenses to reduce the operating expenses? So in this particular case, it would be something like, could we, during this upgrade of the water treatment system, incorporate, say, a solar system to offset some of the energy costs, or a battery system coupled with time of use, time of use operations to potentially reduce that cost over time? Because if you look at the water cost, in the water supply, treatment, and storage, you can see that in 2018 it was 570, and then it just jumped to 730 in 2018, yeah. And so I'm concerned that over time this is going to start eating up. The number's going to go up. I don't know if the percentage is going to go up over the overall budget, but one thing that's sort of a philosophical thing from my perspective is using capital expenditures to reduce operating expenses, because I think that if done right, that can be a very smart long-term, process. And so I just wanted to bring that up, and I figured because there's a lot of work going to be done at that site, it might be an opportune time to look into that. Also, I just want to say as a general thing, I appreciate how the budget has changed in terms of the layout, and how it did call out the healthcare benefits and basically the retirement benefits, and split those out and showed that over time. I think that makes it very clear what those are costing, or what those expenses are for the city, and and I'm glad you guys took some of the recommendations of prior BRC recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And I want to second that. That is probably my favorite modification and improvement in the budget is breaking down those personnel costs. And as I've said before, it's the primary driver of the city's cost across every service we provide is labor cost. And so understanding that better is really important for the public, and I really appreciate that. Other questions? Go ahead, Mr. McKean.
Thank you, Brian. A couple of questions. Under the American Rescue Plan, I'm told that the city of Poway is getting approximately $9 million. My question is, are we required to identify how we spend that money?
Yes, is the short answer. The longer answer is based on my understanding of everything that I've read so far from Treasury. They will be dispersing the funds up front, but in order for us to retain those funds, we absolutely are going to have to substantiate them just like we would for any other grant received from, state or federal government. So, what that could look like is, it would fall per the categories that Treasury has established. And so let's say that was revenue replacement. Based on guidance that came out Monday, they've kind of laid out what their formula for determining your lost revenue is. So it would be things like providing them our financial statements from, the last audit year and then projections forward to substantiate that. But yes, every dollar will have to be substantiated to the federal government.
Can we utilize that money for things like the LMDs, landscape maintenance districts, or tree maintenance?
That's a good question. I honestly don't have an answer for that. They're still working through how they're going to define those broader categories. In general, it does have to do with things pandemic related. So, from a high level, if there is a nexus to the pandemic, then it could be a good candidate, yes.
Another question, does the city plan on any salary increases this year?
Also a good question. Unfortunately, though, because we are in the middle of negotiations, and that is part of the negotiations process, which is a confidential process by law, we can't really talk about, what we are and are not doing as part of that process.
Okay, I respect that. I know there's a lot of open positions. Some personnel are handling 2 jobs. Is the intent of the city to fill those positions this year?
Included within the proposed budget, I think we had 6 unfunded positions that were unfunded as part of our retrenchment strategies last year. Of those, 5 of them are proposed to be filled. There will remain 1 unfunded, that's the management analyst in the city manager's office. The reason we're proposing to fund them this year is that for most of those positions, existing staff were covering the duties of that unfunded position. A purest example of this is the assistant city manager also acting as the community services director, which was unfunded.
Okay.
So yes, most are being proposed to be funded again.
Okay. It's my understanding that there's going to be a bond for the water treatment facility, and if there is, and you can comment on that, I don't know, but would this have any effect on the general budget this year?
So I think there's 2 questions there. One question is, will there be a bond to finance the water improvement projects? And the question, or the answer to that, is potentially. There's a number of different ways that we can finance these projects. Bonds are one, paying as we go is another, right? Just increasing rates dramatically to meet the cash flow needs. There's grant opportunities. For example, we're watching what's going on with the infrastructure plan that's, making its way through the federal government right now. This would be a good candidate for that. And then there's other, state grants as well that could come into play. So bonds are definitely one way that we could finance it. We are, on June 1st, going to be before council providing updated information on those water improvement infrastructure projects. And we plan on having cost estimates in there for the program. and starting to talk about, ways that we might, finance these. So more to come on that June 1st at that council meeting. That's where we'll be able to provide more information. Part of the reason for that is, we're still working through cost estimates, and that staff report will kind of explain why, what the different types of cost estimates are and, kind of what's gone into establishing them.
Aaron, if I can chime in real quick, if you would please, why don't you explain, I'm sure part of this is in response to the town hall that was held on Monday night when there was a reference to a bond being discussed at the June 1st meeting, city council meeting. And we're talking about reimbursement resolution there. Can you just kind of, Aaron, explain what that is? And that once June 1st gets here and should council approve the staff request, it does not commit us to any bonds. It just positions us to be able to be smart about how any bond proceeds could be used. Aaron?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we're very, very concerned with, well, backing up just a second, fundamentally our goal is always, whenever we're talking water and wastewater and rate setting, our primary foundational goal is whatever we're doing, we're always trying to minimize the impacts to ratepayers. And there's a number of different things that, can be done to do that. Another one, and in that vein, when we're talking about all the different ways that we can finance these projects, giving ourselves the most flexibility in order to respond to the projects as they evolve is really beneficial in helping keep costs low. So one of the tools that we are going to recommend to council is something called the Reimbursement Resolution. It does relate to issuing bonds in particular. And what it is, it's a indication to the IRS that we're not trying to play games with debt issuance. There's some stuff that went on in the past with debt issuance where you could effectively infinitely roll over your debt and kind of make out on the rate differentials associated with doing that. The IRS didn't like that, and so they basically said that you can't, they put restrictions in place to control that. And they said, if you are going to play around with stuff like that, you can issue taxable debt. Well, taxable debt has a higher, yield on it than tax-exempt debt, right? And so what that translates to for ratepayers is a higher cost, right? That's going to, all else being equal, create a larger impact per ratepayer. So what the reimbursement resolution does is it signals the IRS that we're not messing around, that we intend to, only issue debt for this specific set of projects. So we have to identify the projects, put in what our reasonable cost estimates are at this time. And then doing that allows us to keep the debt issuance as tax exempt, which has a lower cost of debt, lower cost of carry, which translates to lower cost to ratepayers. And then it also allows us to time the debt issuance if we ultimately issue debt. And that's important because you don't necessarily always want to issue debt exactly when you need it from a cash flow standpoint. There may be benefits to, timing the market, so to speak. And so this gives you the flexibility to reimburse yourself for costs that occurred prior to when you actually went out and issued the debt. So that's effectively what June 1st is doing. And again, there's, going to be a big bold statement that says it doesn't indicate that the city has to issue a debt. There's actually a separate set of council actions that needs to take place in order for us to go to market with bonds. And then the second part of your question was related to, will this impact the general fund on the debt side? And in general, under California constitutional law, ratepayer funds have to be kept separate. And so no, they're two separate entities from a money standpoint.
Okay.
And does that come out of the debt service funds to pay those back?
So if we were to issue debt, what we would be doing is using the annual rate revenue to service that annual debt service payment. So, so one of the benefits actually of debt on large dollar projects like this, because historically all of the, recent water projects have been PAYGO funded. So, we need to do a $3 million project. We build that into the cash flow and increase rate slowly over time to fund that. For large dollar projects, doing that would cause immense rate shock to everybody trying to raise that amount of revenue over a 3 to 4 year period.
Yeah.
So one of the pros of debt is that you can basically spread that cost over 30 years, so that lowers the immediate rate impact to ratepayers. Of course, there are carrying costs, interest costs associated with that, which drives up the total cost. But it helps spread that over time, helping reduce the burden now, one. Two, there's a strong argument for intergenerational equity. Some of the assets talked about Monday night are estimated to have 100+ year useful life. Like those concrete tanks, they're rated for 75 years plus on their asset life, but that's just because they've only been in place for 75 years. The manufacturers think that people will get 100 years plus. So when you look at it from an asset life standpoint, spreading these costs out to future generations that will also be receiving the benefit from these assets, from an equity standpoint, makes sense. That way you're not asking, current people to fully fund something that's going to be in place long after, they might not be using it anymore.
So from a personal financial standpoint that most people would understand, you have $600,000 in your checking account, you can go buy a home for $600,000, or you could kind of put some down, finance it, spread it over time so that you can cash flow it. And given the current interest rate environment, it might be more appealing for taxpayers so that we all don't have to feel the brunt of increased water expenses.
Yeah, that's yes, right. You're preserving that 600,000 on hand, or not trying to come up with 600,000 tomorrow.
Right. And getting to this, part of my question was in the actual water utility fund on page 14, is that kind of laid out in the projected capital program? Is that what you have as the 8.592 million for the 21-22 budget? But then there's 13.7 million for this last fiscal year. So is this water projects that we're talking about in those numbers?
Pieces of them are, yes. So like the early planning costs for those projects are in there, yes. So your design costs for all three of the primary big ones are in those numbers, yes. Now, there's a lot, if you look in the CIP section of the budget, there's a lot of other just, water projects being done as well. So it's a combination of those two things. And, as the costs get more, as we pin those numbers down, they'll be incorporated into our budget. Now, you're not going to see, let's say, the 22-23 numbers in here, right? But that will show up in our rate model as we're, forecasting out over time. And then if we're going to issue debt for those costs, we translate it from a, let's say a X million in year 2 to a debt service payment over a longer period of time.
And so my other question in regards to this specific fund, I noticed that the revenue from last fiscal year was hovering in the 29+ million, and it jumps up to 45. And so that is staggering to me, and I want to drill down on where that change is coming from.
That's good. That's a great observation. What that is it's a placeholder for funding the longer term projects. So the funds are not projected to be there, but if we don't do the issuance or some of these other strategies to implement the capital projects, then the taxpayers will have to pay for the increased water usage. Is that what it is? So yes, it's a placeholder for financing a portion of the water projects. What, we're looking at is maybe a phase one
Okay.
funding. And so while it hasn't happened yet, we're going to be doing something more than likely next fiscal year. We can't, even if that was, so backing up a step, we adopted 2-year rates. We're in the second year of that 2-year rate setting process right now. So this fall, September and November are our current target months. We'll be going to council with proposed rate increases for the coming calendar years. So whether it was built into those rate increases, just purely from a, cash flow, we need to finance this all today standpoint, whether it included a bond issuance, and that's how we choose to approach this, or whether there's grant money in there. Those details haven't worked out yet, been finalized
Right.
yet. But from a budgeting standpoint, we know we're going to be doing it. We have a general magnitude of it, which
Gotcha.
you're seeing the difference there. And so one way or another, something will happen or the projects will stall out.
And so, say, for example, if we need the 13 million to complete just the water treatment facility, whether it's increase in to the taxpayers, the dollar amounts in your water usage, or issuance, that's that number, that if you issue a bond of some sort, that's where you're getting that.
Yeah, and so from a display purpose in the budget, you're going to see, so it may change
Right.
if we issue debt, right? You're going to see a chunk of money come in
Right.
as revenue, and then you'll see a incremental expense over time. If for some reason we were going to recommend rate funding it, that number would drop down in reality.
Okay.
Because we're not, the
Right.
project's not going to go out and spend $13 million
Yeah.
next year. And so then if it was going to be that way, that number would depress and we would push out, the revenue over time. But based on what we have now, that's the placeholder for that.
And does that 8.59 million also, is this budget part of that San Diego cleanup, or is that kind of kicked down the road further?
The Los Penasquitos?
Yes, that one.
Yeah, so that council approved that, entering into the agreement with San Diego for the cost share of that a few council meetings ago.
Yes.
And so those numbers, really where that's going to hit, general fund.
General fund.
Unassigned fund balance. So let me get up there real quick so people can see.
Is that considered
As an expenditure?
Well, yes, it will be as an expenditure. They approved it off cycle just due to timing differences. It's not in either one of these, but it's going to be ticking away at this unassigned fund balance at the bottom there.
And was that supposed to be between 6 and 7 million?
Yeah, it's a little less than 7 million. Mhm.
Yeah.
And so one of the good things on that actually, that Development Services made me very happy on was instead, San Diego originally wanted us to write them a check for that all at once, which that's a bummer because, the way capital projects work, right? You don't spend all your dollars at once, you spend it over time.
Right.
And so what we would have been effectively doing if we gave them a check today, let's say, is giving them the benefit of our interest earnings. So Development Services was able to negotiate with San Diego to spread the payments out over time, more consistent with the project cash flow. So that's
And is there
deal.
an anticipated time frame of that project? Is it 2 years, 3 years, 4 years?
I feel like it's 5 or.
It's actually 8 years.
Yeah,
We'll be
okay.
financing.
8 years.
Yeah, and I hesitate to even call it financing because we're really not financing. We're just kind of repaying as we're going along our portion, and it's over an 8-year period.
So then we're not gonna have that much of a cash flow outlay if we're splitting up, under 7 million over 8 years. And so we're not gonna feel it like a huge hit like we would if we had the water treatment facility.
Correct. This is related specifically to phase 1. The 8 years is for phase 1.
Do we know what?
And we've not committed anything for phase 2 at this point.
So, okay, so right now we don't know So it's either, it's a little less than darn it. So it's a little less than 7 million now. And so for the phase 2, is this like, we can opt out, or is it gonna be, you're gonna give us the money? Because,
We do have some protections in place there. We have not committed to a phase 2
Okay.
right now.
all right,
But it does make sense, obviously, if we were in on phase 1, we'll probably be on phase 2 to some degree, but we are not committed to anything, and the MOU is specific to just phase 1 right now, over the next 8 years, starting right now.
got it. And do we have an idea from them as to what they think phase 2 is gonna cost? Or a ballpark idea?
We've heard all kinds of ranges of numbers that I'm
Okay.
very hesitant to even throw out because,
All right.
we'll remember those, whatever I throw out right now. and
Fair enough.
We're just not prepared to discuss that at this point.
I understand. Okay, and so this is viewed as a capital project, this type of thing? And it's like we're putting the money into something that's being built, and we're not viewing this as we're gonna be sort of dripping out money over the next 50 years as, to pay for their retirement benefits?
So we're viewing it as a cost-sharing agreement for a regional capital improvement project that, theoretically, once it's been constructed,
We're
the
done.
obligations end, but, the way things go in general is, rules change and stuff needs to be redone. But yes, this is theoretically a finite event played out over a number of years.
Just a really quick, going back to the capital improvement projects for the water side, actually, and sewer, there are a fair number, I think, as you alluded to, capital projects involved in both of those enterprise funds. If there's going to be a bond issuance for this very large, improvement to the water system, is there any thought of bundling basically these other projects into that? Would it make sense to do that, or?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it comes down to, the trade-offs of the, impact to ratepayer now versus the carry cost of debt.
Right.
And so that is something that we look at, and we are, the short answer is we explore that as part of our rate setting process and what our projections are for the upcoming capital projects in both of those systems.
Thank you.
So I had a sort of follow-up question with the capital project for the water. The 45 million that was shown as revenue, that's actually, could actually be a bond. A substantial amount of that could be a bond. And somewhere surely there's got to be a cost. So you're paying for the debt somehow, right?
Yeah, so you see here on the screen, kind of normal revenue runs in the just under $30 million range. And that's covering annual operating costs, it's covering the, pay-go capital improvement projects. So the bump up there is, related to those 3 larger projects, by and large. And yes, as you said, the debt does have a carry cost associated with that. And so in the rate modeling, we build that in. We flesh out an amortization schedule that has principal, interest, and, what our assumed debt issuance costs will be. And then we adjust to, what the actual issuance, if we were to issue debt, ends up being.
Is the timing, if you need, I'm assuming that the city gets a bond, is it important to be quick with the timing on that? Otherwise, the cost of delay may make things much more expensive.
So when you issue debt, it's like getting like a home equity loan, right?
So it can be fast.
You get access to the cash right away, and in the case of the bond, they send you, if you issue a bond for $5 million, they send you $5 million in cash as soon as the issuance closes, and then you pay on that over the next 30 years. So from that standpoint, there's really no urgency. You know, once we have the cash, we pay regardless of whether the project takes 5 years to build or we can get it done in 6 months. And then, you know, if we were going to look at like a series of bonds, then, you know, that would come into play with the greater economic environment, what's going on with interest rates and stuff like that. So, you know, the longer you wait in a rising interest environment, right, the higher that carry cost is going to be for the debt. So from that standpoint, yes, but then you also don't want to go out and issue everything all at once right now, even though you don't need it, because that causes issues as well.
Okay. So I had another sort of comment on the Los Penasquitos. That's phase one is 6.9 million. It looks like it's going to be over, I think, 8 years. When it came up at council, there was a lot of discussion about that, whether the city could argue with the pool of people involved, and that, you know, why is it we're having to pay so much? So this is probably something that would actually require revenue, but Poway cleans all these waterways and tries to minimize silt. Would it be appropriate to try and get the data to show how much our silt contribution is or isn't? And then when we want to argue with the other parties to this agreement, we have the data to say that this is how much silt we're putting in or not putting in. This, I believe, is how much our contribution should be. Because right now it's like we do everything right, we're good citizens, and it doesn't matter, we're still going to have to pay 6.9 million. So that's just a suggestion. I think that would probably cost some money, though. Other folks have actually covered some of the other things I wanted to ask questions about. But when I look, one thing I was interested in is capital replacement. The city uses a lot of vehicles. We're under pressure in California to get away from, you know, fossil fuel driven vehicles. We should have electric vehicles by 2035. My sense is, because of where we live and the government we've got, the state government we've got, that's at some point going to become a mandate that you can't run gasoline powered equipment. Is it appropriate when we look at capital replacement right now, when we're replacing vehicles, to take the maximum advantage the city can on tax rebates for, say, hybrid vehicles or electric vehicles? So it's just an idea, but I suspect in 5 years' time, we're going to have to get rid of gasoline-powered vehicles or have a certain percentage of electric or hybrid. Now, if we do it proactively, there may be some good tax breaks for the city.
So when our fleet is looking at cars for replacement, cost is always, you know, primary concern for them. So I know that's what's guiding them. I did reach out to our fleet group today to kind of pose the question you just asked. And they said that while, you know, we're not currently doing that they did agree with you that this is likely coming down the line with change in legislation. So it's definitely on their minds.
Yeah, my concern is that you're going to be forced to do it. If you start to do it now, you can be in a much better financial position. So
We might be withheld with what's available on the market, given, you know, we're going to be purchasing 2 new ambulances, but it's not like there's electric ambulances available.
Not yet, no.
Or
Yeah.
if we need F-150s, we're getting F-150s. There's not an electric option at this point. So I think some of the state legislation is forcing the hand of the manufacturers, and hopefully that'll get the technology where it needs to be. But I think you make a valid point that if we're kind of ahead of the curve, where we're not being forced to then go compete with other municipalities,
You'd be ahead.
all for the same inventory and
Right.
supply and demand. If the supply is low and the demand is high, then we're all paying premium.
Yeah, and right now, I was looking at hybrids. The tax breaks are actually pretty good. Yeah. So.
But hey, maybe we tell the city council to start putting in those more plug-in stations, and then we can start using that money to buy our electric vehicles.
Well, that was one of the, I mean, I'm going off different trajectory now, but that housing element, there was a lot of people wrote in about, you know, hybrids and having plug-in stations and stuff like that. So clearly there's people in the town, including myself, would like to see us be more environmentally friendly, but I would appreciate if we could do that in a way that saves us money.
Well, I mean, when we have Amazon here,
They're
that they've
electric.
made the commitment to be completely electric, but because they're a big enough conglomerate that they can go straight to the manufacturer and say, hey, we're gonna buy 30,000 widgets, make it, they will. We're just probably not there.
Are these types of rebates available for cities, or are they more like for individuals?
That's a good question. I don't know under the current rebate programs. I haven't looked at them in a while, but historically, the city did benefit from them as well. In other cities that I'm aware that have, purchased electric vehicles as part of their fleet.
And Bob has his hand up.
I did. I had one final question. I know the Poway Community Performing Arts Center is a fluid situation. The council's looking into things, but my question is, what impact does Pcpa and Poway on Stage have in this budget for this year?
I can handle that question. This would be, well, probably both hats right now. Maybe more the community services director hat at the moment. So at the April 6th City Council meeting, we did have a pretty lengthy workshop where council gave us direction on a number of items that we're going to be working on over the next year. The only significant change that's presented in this budget, because most of the things we're working on, it's going to take us some time to get through, and they wouldn't take effect until the fiscal year 22-23 budget. The only substantial change for next year would be council provided direction not to include a direct cash subsidy in the budget for Poway on Stage. So the budget as it's been presented to you all does not include any direct contribution, but that was a council workshop. So until council takes action to approve the budget, it's still subject to change. But right now that is not reflected in the budget that's presented.
Okay, thanks.
And where you can see that under our aggregated totals is this professional contract services line item here. So you see there's a decline here in 21-22 as compared to prior year.
Great, are we good on that? Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Great. Other comments or questions right now? Okay, then I think that concludes this item. That means we move on to item 3, the review of fiscal year 2020 through 2021 budget review committee recommendations. If you're on the phone and you wish to speak on this item, please press *9 now. Once it's time, the city clerk will call you in the order received. Do we have any public speakers on this? Great. Director of Finance, Aaron Beaton, will present this item.
All right, so the idea behind this was to kind of go over what the current year's budget BRC recommendations were, and kind of the things that staff has been doing consistent with those recommendations. And this is really to help kind of update on what's been going on, and then also to provide some ideas for perhaps the BRC's recommendations for this fiscal year 21-22 budget. So first recommendation BRC had surrounded personnel costs and, controlling those costs and being thoughtful about personnel costs, given that they represent, a large portion of the budget. And one thing that relates to that we're currently in the process of is negotiations. And, as I brought up earlier, I can't really talk about more than that, but we are going through that process right now as it relates to our personnel. Another recommendation for the current year budget was to really focus on revenue growth as a way to help the general fund out. And some things that we're doing there, a month ago, thereabouts, the Mickey Cafagna Center fees went to council for their consideration. And what was different about these fees was it was more of a market-based approach, which is consistent in the kind of community services, parks and rec industry. So they really took a look at the fee categories we had. Do they still make sense? And really kind of streamline that process and propose a set of fees that are much simpler. They take into account, non-resident and residents, similar to what they did before, but again, ensuring that we're kind of in line with others that have similar facilities. And then kind of unrelated to fees, but also of note on the revenue side with respect to the Mickey Cafagna Center is just the different way they are approaching using the space now and the rental opportunities. They're, community services is really looking at different ways to rent that facility as a way to help drive revenue. So, not an increase in fees per se, but it is a use change that we think is going to be beneficial to the city. Another thing that we're currently in the process of is we're looking at our ambulance fees as part of our review of different revenues. We saw a kind of deviation from our ambulance fees to others in the county, and it was significant enough that we are in the process of conducting an ambulance fee study that takes a look at our costs and then tries to determine what would be appropriate fees based on those costs, based on how we get reimbursed from the insurance carriers, et cetera. And so, the results of that study are going to be brought forward to council for their consideration sometime a little bit later this year. So those are a couple things that we're doing on the revenue growth side of things.
Do you have the projected Mickey Cafagna revenue that are in the budget for this year coming up?
Community, you can answer if you want.
Or which one is it falling under? Is it the community park budget?
It would be it would be within the community park budget. When we took the fees to council, we weren't sure what was happening with COVID regulations. If the new community center operates exactly as it did before with the exact same rental groups, we would see an increase in revenue.
Gotcha.
But I think until we get fully opened, which we aren't sure when that will happen, and I think across the board for community services, I'm not sure if Aaron shared this,
No.
but the approach that we took with COVID, because we started working on budget back in December, was anticipating that we'd be able to start to come back to some regular programming in early fall and ramp our way back up to resuming normal operations in January. So across the board, you're going to see lower projected revenues in community services than if we were really at full operation.
Yeah, so as Wendy brought up, I gave them kind of a rate ramp, so a set of assumptions to use in forecasting their revenue.
Gotcha.
And as the county, state health mandates change, that could change that projection. So we could see, different revenue than projected.
Do you need to go before the council to change the rates, or can you basically make internal decisions based on the market performance of the center to adjust rates to maintain occupancy as reasonably high, but not, over-occupied to maximize, profit?
We had indicated to council so the fees we adopted for community center were a unique new structure for us. I think ultimately, Chris and I would like to get us to that structure for all of the community services facilities because it is much more simplified. But we had indicated to council, because it was a change in structure, we would be monitoring activity at community center because none of us want to open a brand new community center and see space go vacant. But I think, again, because of COVID, it's probably going to be a year or maybe next full fiscal year before we really understand the full use pattern at the facility in normal operations. But I will plug, we just put out, we're going to start accepting reservations next week, and I think people are pretty excited. And if you haven't seen it already, we've got some professional pictures that were taken.
They look good.
And I think we're going to draw a whole new type of clientele. I don't know how many of you had an opportunity to go in the old community center, but I think the new space is going to draw a lot more people because of the new facility, how nice it is, and I think it's got the potential to fill up and probably fill up really fast for those prime days of the week for activities. But we're definitely planning to monitor it and potentially bring back changes to fee structures at other locations that mirror what we're doing at community centers.
I have a quick question on the maintenance of the facility. There's nothing that's worse than seeing a government agency build a beautiful facility and then not maintain it properly as the years go on. Can you just address, how Poway is planning on, fully maintaining that, and can we expect to see a well-maintained, beautiful community center for many years to come?
We've budgeted for that, and unfortunately, and I don't know that we've talked about this yet as a group, but we have seen our janitorial contracts go up across the city. We've seen other maintenance type contracts. We are accounting for that in the new budget that we're presenting. But at the time we went out to build the facility, we anticipated maintaining the same level of service and the same staffing level, and that will be true for the facility, but I think it's going to cost us more than it did when we took down the old facility, and that would be the case even if we hadn't built something new, because our costs are just going up in some of those areas.
We have to pay prevailing wage on that for the janitorial services? Is it prevailing wage on that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and in that line, right, this goes back to kind of our whole approach to capital asset management. And, you may remember some of the comments from council last year where, and staff, where we said, one way that we can help get through this economic event is to, defer those capital replacement charges, right? So part of it is the ongoing, cost that Wendy indicated with the, janitorial and the like. And then the other is what we're setting aside to ensure that we can maintain that facility into the future. So every intention, yes, of maintaining it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So next kind of comment from BRC last year had to do with budget readability. We've made a lot of changes to it. One thing that I touched on in an earlier meeting was, we are switching up those cash flow pages where the actual columns are true actuals now and not a combination of actuals and budget. And that's just for anybody that wants to do trending, it's a purer look at what's going on. I like to constantly tweak and improve, and so, we'll keep at this. This is not, a one and done. Another comment was on vacancies, hiring, and volunteers, talking about, being very thoughtful when we choose to fill vacancies. There were comments made on, that appreciated some of the council members, requesting volunteer help to, help with the LMDs and things like that. And so, what we're doing related to that is, as kind of Chris brought up, I think it was last meeting, every vacancy that comes up, we absolutely are looking at, do we need it? Do we need it in this particular way? Could we use it in a different way? And so that's just kind of part of our normal process. As we've discussed, we're a very lean organization. And so we're always trying to ensure that we have the right resources to provide the services that we're providing. And so what we did during this year's budget is really took a hard look at those positions, kind of how staff was being impacted, those people doing more than one job, and how sustainable that was. And we recommended funding those that we felt were absolutely necessary to continue services at their current levels. Then, as I mentioned, we did leave one of those positions unfunded in the city manager's budget. Another set of comments surrounded the planning division and, finding ways to increase efficiencies there. And honestly, this is one of my favorite projects. Last fall, council approved the purchase of a civic services software called EnerGov. And some of the cool things about that is people will be able to apply for any type of permit that we offer online. They can pay for it online. For some of the smaller permit types, they can get approval online and just print their permit directly out from online. So like, like a water heater permit or something. Plan review can be done electronically. So a developer doesn't have to walk in plans to the city. They can submit them online. We can review them all electronically and provide those back to, the developer online. It will be a great tool for transparency, letting both sides know where a project is in the pipeline. You can see the workflow associated with that. And for, some of our larger volume users, it will really speed up the process for those kind of more routine things like, let's say, solar project permitting.
So I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you have a fee scale where you request a larger fee for expedited processing? I mean, this is what the patent office, the passport office does this, right? If you want your passport quickly, you have to pay a heck of a lot more. So could you consider a fee structure where if somebody wanted it expedited, you can charge them more money?
I would my first thought on that is what are the legal requirements with that. So I don't have an answer for that. So I'd start there to figure that out, and then from there.
Yeah, and I don't think we can actually do that legally. Service is service. Someone doesn't get a higher level of service because they're willing to pay more or have an ability to pay more. We provide a level of service to everybody equally.
Okay, I just wondered because
Yeah.
passport office.
But it's a creative thought, understand it.
Yeah, if you want your passport quickly, you have to pay more.
I think I'd add too that we also have requirements in California that once a complete application is submitted,
Okay.
we have a mandatory timeline by which we have to review and make decisions on it. So that I think would also complicate an expedited permit process. But I
Okay.
agree. Great idea.
But probably making the streamlining of the process will eventually probably reduce some of the expenditures associated with having somebody at the clerk's office instead of maybe having 2 or 3 people there to take in plans. We're kind of going to these electronic interfaces that might have later reduced expenses that we will take advantage of. So I think that's a good improvement.
I think one thing that would be very useful, oh, sorry.
Maybe it was on. Sorry, maybe I
think
give
it's
you that
on.
advice. I apologize.
My fault. Okay.
My hearing's
Too many
going.
buttons. It's like one button. So, one thing I think would be very useful for the city council and actually probably the city staff or management would be to have an idea of the turnaround times for an individual putting in an application, how long it takes to actually get finally approved, like built. And so people will come back, multiple times. How many times does that happen? What are people coming back for? So that if there's a particular class of item people are having trouble understanding, it can be brought out. I'm hoping the software can do that so that if in the future before the council they say, okay, we're having this particular problem with this particular regulation, maybe it can be made more clear or streamlined or get an idea of why is it actually there to begin with. And I think if we're able to have an efficient, I hear from other people that it's really difficult to build things in Poway. And I think that can be a problem from a financial standpoint because a lot of our budget, the money comes from, property taxes. You can improve your property taxes by improving your property. And if you can't do that, or it's high cost to do that, it's not going to happen as quickly as we'd ideally like to see. And being able to track these things at a little granular detail can guide and focus the council and the staff into where improvements can be made.
If I could just chime in here quickly, I just also want to second that. I know city staff are under a lot of restrictions that the state places on what you have to do and what you have to review and all that. But, I also, another hat I wear is the chairman of the Poway Chamber of Commerce, and I certainly hear from businesses and residents that this can be a frustration. So, and I know we've talked about it at previous BRCs over the years, so I'd just like to also chime in and say, that this is really important that the city get it right, and anything we can do to expedite this stuff is a big plus for the city and the residents and businesses it serves.
That's, yes, one of the things during the demo of this software was showing, you can see both from a completion standpoint, so, this process is 28% complete. So you get an idea of what's left to do. You can see who has it currently in the step. Is it with staff person A, staff person B? Is it back with the applicant? So all of that is very, very transparent, which I think, is a great communication tool, because a lot of times things go on because we don't know, right? So kind of,
Right.
Peter, to your point, right? So this definitely brings that information out in front for, the applicant and staff to both see. So yes, where there are issues or opportunities, it's going to be much clearer to see. Now, this is in the same, so Tyler is the software company that produces EnerGov. Munis, which is our financial information system, is also from them. So this is going to improve connectivity between those two systems, which helps a lot. But just, kind of a plug for Tyler and why I'm excited about EnerGov is Munis it's a very, very powerful tool that, we've only started scratching the surface on. So, again, we're very excited for these because we do see a lot of opportunity in these systems for helping us provide services to people.
And it probably will make it easier where you can see things through the workflow in a digital manner and how to push things forward to make projects get completed quicker. I think that probably will be an improvement. I wonder if the city of Poway would consider things like what the county is doing, where they have pre-approved plans for ADUs or certain things that we, like he stated, might have a higher volume of permit requests, that then, the city council could take that information into consideration and get some pre-approved plans. So instead of, Joe Smith having to go to an architect to build an ADU and an engineer to look at all the plans, you can just go to this county website and pay the permitting fee, and it's all ready to go. You hand it to your contractor. I think those things can really be utilized to improve the processes.
That's a good idea, yeah. All right, another comment was, related to Pcpa and its impact on the general fund. And so, a couple things, really notable things on this, because it's kind of been a evolving process, is in April, beginning of April, council had the Pcpa workshop in which they gave staff a lot of very clear direction on what they wanted to see from a policy level take place with respect to that facility and its impact on the general fund. So staff's in the process of starting to implement that set of policy directives. Another thing to note is on May 18th, we're taking a staff report forward related to a potential donation from the McCarthy Foundation that is geared towards helping the Pcpa out as an endowment. So both of those things are going on. So if you want to learn more about the potential donation, May 18th is,
So have you approached local businesses to sponsor the Pcpa, or, I made the suggestion, which was, somewhat facetious, but can you give someone naming rights? We have huge employers in town like General Atomics and Amazon. Would people be opposed to them naming the center if they paid enough money?
I think in the past, the council's been hesitant to go down the road of naming rights, but I will say one of the action items, and it's actually tied to the donation that Aaron mentioned, One of the action items coming out of council is to do a feasibility study regarding the potential to create an endowment. And a major component of that is going to be pulling together stakeholders throughout the city, and that will include those big name businesses that you just mentioned, getting them to the table to be talking about potentially significant donations to establish the endowment.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to say stay sort of really pure and it's a town thing, but realistically, it loses money, and if they can name baseball fields and, you know, concert halls, why not name this and get some money for it?
All right. The recommendations also brought up fire safety services, and you know, there were some comments on overtime and retirement, and there's an ongoing, you know, kind of mathematical tension between, you know, overtime costs associated with certain staffing levels versus hiring more firefighters to try and eliminate those overtime costs. And so I think the recommendation was surrounding that, and maybe as people are transitioning from the classic retirement formulas to the Pepper retirement formulas, maybe that would change that math equation. You know, staff really doesn't have anything to, you know, comment on that. Based on, you heard the fire chief speak to this at the earlier meeting, so I would say that's the best information for that.
I have a quick question, and it kind of goes across all the board in regards to pension costs. Of the pension cost, how much of that is just current employees that are receiving, you know, their paycheck deferred benefits versus are some of those costs people that are currently on pension that's on our budget?
Yes, so that when we write a check to CalPERS every year, it's comprised of two things. One is called the normal cost, so that's what we have to pay year over year for existing employees and the projection on those benefits. Then we have the other component of that payment, which is the unfunded actuarial liability, the UAL, and that is both reflective of people who are currently receiving a pension. If we were supposed to set $100 aside for them, CalPERS says, well, you only set aside 80, so now you owe us 20 more. And
I see.
So it's a combination of those two things, and pension reform was geared to, among other things, put structures in place to ensure the payment of that unfunded liability over time. And so I had kind of talked about that during the long-range forecast. Those rates are projected to peak in the mid-20s, and then how that actually impacts our annual payments will be dependent upon, you know, whether salary increases are involved in that. But just as a kind of general piece of information, you can never truly fully fund a pension. So, you know, you may have seen in the news agencies paying off the pension via with CalPERS and converting that into pension obligation bond debt and trying to, you know, see a benefit in the rate differential there. So even once they pay that debt off, you're still going to have unfunded liability popping up over time, and that's because the easiest example is CalPERS assumes that they're going to earn 7% each year, and CalPERS does not earn exactly 7% each year, so they either earn more or less than that in the market for their asset portfolio. So if they earn less, then what that does is, in order for them to pay benefits promised to the retirees, they have to get that cash from somewhere else. So that comes from each of the member agencies. And that's part of what drives that unfunded liability.
I see.
And conversely, they earn more than we get a benefit over time. But point is you can never fully extinguish that. So it's really more about the management of it.
I had a question. You said something interesting about an example of an agency that didn't pay the full $100 in that example. Just to clarify, does Poway fully pay its pension obligation that CalPERS gives it each year?
Correct. So CalPERS sends out a bill that includes both those components I talked about, and yes, we pay that in full each year. And in fact, we pay it. We have an option to pay it all up front, so we can take that year's bill and pay it by, I think, July 15th maybe each year, sometime early in July. And if we write a check for the full amount, we actually get a discount of 6 months worth of interest. And so that, that's saving us money. So we do that because what we earn on our portfolio is less than, that break from CalPERS. So we overall make out better by doing that.
Given that you guys are currently in negotiations for the new contracts, I know Nick had mentioned it in the public email sent. Is there ever consideration to go to more like the private sector, where we go to more of a defined contribution plan versus a defined benefit plan, since this is, going to be a constant, anchor to the budget that will just never go away?
Yeah. So you're absolutely correct. It will not go away as long as pensions exist. And I do truly believe that pension reform did a lot to help bring pension costs to a manageable level over time. And they did it over, a 40-year planning horizon.
Right.
So I do believe there will be improvements in that. Now, to speak to could we change plans? So there's a lot of rules surrounding that. But bottom line is you have to basically buy out the pension plan, and you have to buy out everybody that's currently in it, that's still working, and you have to buy out what their projected work life is going to be. And then you have to buy out the people that are already retired. You have to fully fund whatever that projected amount is. So just to give you an example, in 2018, the city contracted with Bartell & Associates, which is a very, very prominent actuarial firm in the state of California. And one of the questions asked was, what would it cost us to buy out of this pension plan and go do something different, like a 401k type of deal?
Right.
And estimates at that time were between $170 and $200 million.
Okay.
So, significantly more, because we don't have that cash sitting around.
Right.
It's just
right.
financially infeasible to
right.
do. So really, it's looking at different ways that we can manage that annual cost, and then layered on with the pension reform and all the strategies being employed to ensure that does, over the next, 5-ish,
Right.
10 years, really start materially decreasing costs of the city.
Is there any way that we can grandfather people into the existing plan, and then new hires going forward have a new contract, much like private sector did? So, like, for example, my father worked for Motorola for 25 years and had a pension plan. And at a certain point in the mid-90s, they said, hey, this is like an unfunded liability that's going to sink our company, and there's only so many walkie-talkies we can sell. And so therefore, they grandfathered the existing members. So then you don't have that huge 200 million liability, but hey, those people, that gets in one sleeve over here, and then everybody new gets this sleeve over here. And so then you have this 20, 30-year trajectory of reducing those expenses, much like we're going to see the budget reform, like you had mentioned, for the pension reform in the mid-20s. That might also be a strategy, which, again, there's so many rules and parameters and handcuffs that we're tied to that it's more conjecture than if it's actually feasible from my standpoint.
So I don't know of any agency considering adjusting the pension formula beyond what pension reform did with the, PEPRA members. I will say that, back in between the Great Recession when pension reform hit, everybody's retirement system now for that time period is considered a classic member. And there were a number of agencies that in between, pension reform and the Great Recession said, we need to take that step to, adjust the retirement formula. And Poway was one of those. So we actually have 3 different levels. One, that's considered truly classic.
Gotcha.
And then they took the additional step to do that. And what that did was anybody new coming in, just like you described, would
Right.
be on that second tier. And everybody in the classic tier would be grandfathered in. And then pension reform came along and created an even different tier. And so now legally everybody new into the system goes into that tier. Now I don't know, I don't want to speak for sure. I don't know if it's possible. I'd have to go back and look at all the legislation around pension reform that
Right.
it didn't allow.
Which I wasted some time doing that. I don't know if it's waste, but I definitely,
Yeah.
did much research and I see it from a personal financial standpoint often. So I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on it, and yet I still don't fully understand. And when I look at people that are in the private sector that have defined contribution plans, and those companies have a 4 to 10% liability on salary, and when I look at our budget and our pension retirement is 30+%, and it's improving, right? But we are so vastly away from what private sector does. But I think that's also part of being a civil servant. You don't necessarily get the salary benefits. It's the other benefits that you take advantage of. So I also understand that component. But these are definitely considerations for, I think, longer range forecasting and obviously things that are outside of our purview for deciding on.
Yeah, you did bring up a really great point, and that I would categorize as total compensation and attraction
Absolutely.
and retention, right?
Right.
So everybody has different levers of getting compensation to an individual. So yeah, when
True.
you mess with one, then over the long term, somewhere else is gonna adjust because of that. So.
Absolutely.
All right, so we have Budget Review Committee also brought up the mitigation of unexpected financial risk, and kind of the example used was Los Penasquitos project there. And one thing that I think is a fantastic example of this actually is the water infrastructure program. Fundamentally, at its heart, it's exactly that. It's proactive maintenance to help avoid the unintended financial consequences of a aging infrastructure failing, right? And so by being proactive, trying to increase resiliency and redundancy and sustainability within that asset group, we are, specifically addressing this. And then the last thing is the long range forecast. And back in March, we kind of brought a version 1.0 forward to council. And what I've said since we've taken that to council is this is similar to kind of budget readability, but much more significant, much more important, is that we continue to, evaluate the efficacy of the forecast and then improve it. And there's a number of different things in the forecast world that can be added in to help provide more information and better communication on what's going on with or projected to go on with the city's finances over time. So, and that's kind of, what the BRC recommended this year, and then kind of what staff's been working on that's, consistent with that.
Great, thank you for that, and I know it's already getting relatively late, but I was happy to let that pension discussion go on because, you were asking some great questions, and that is, in my opinion, the singular issue that is affecting Poway and every other public agency in California. It's just, it's a mess, so, I was glad to have us dive into that a little bit more. So, I know we asked some questions, feel free to ask any questions right now, but we might want to take a quick recess here of 10 or 15 minutes and look at if the committee wants to review last year's budget memo and what I've passed around, which is kind of built on that as a starting point for this year's budget memo. This would be a good time to do that, I think. Another option is that we just come back next week with our thoughts on it, but I'll defer to the committee if there's any desire to take a recess, look at the proposed memo that I've taken some time putting together some of my thoughts, and then we can go off of that tonight if we wanted to.
I ask one more question,
Yeah.
then a recess
please.
would be fine. So when it comes to the funding in the next 2 years, the revenue, is that including what we expect to get from what I call the American Recovery Act? So that's already in there.
Yes, that is
Okay.
in there, yes.
That's what I wanted to understand. So then I brought this up once before. I think one has to be, very proactive in making sure that we get and keep that money. So I'm not sure if people looking at the budget are necessarily going to be aware of, where the money's coming from. Then the other thought I had is that as a city, and certainly the council always seems to give this impression that they're blindsided by what comes out of Sacramento. Do we proactively look at what's happening? I assume we do. What's happening in Sacramento, and how do we communicate that to the council? Because when I watch the council, so many times I hear, we can't control this. It comes from Sacramento. We can't. The Los Penasquitos was another one. Well, we just have to do this. Whereas if there's a little bit more people being a little bit more proactive, we could be prepared for it. Which is why I brought up the electric vehicle thing. I don't necessarily think you should rush out and buy electric vehicles, but I suspect that's what's coming, and we need to be more proactive and understand where the legislation is going to push us. So that's all I was going to say. So.
We do belong to the League of California Cities, which represents all city interests at the legislature, and they send out regular information to us about all the, I'll say they're generally bad bills that are coming out that are generally aimed toward limiting local control that can impact revenues. And we send letters of opposition along with other cities. The league gives us templates to send those letters of opposition, and we do, but unfortunately, I don't think that they carry a lot of weight. So we try and we monitor and we know what's coming, but unfortunately, I think we don't have a lot of control over what's coming.
I'm not criticizing the people in this room,
No.
believe me, but what worries me is when when I listen from the council and they throw their hands up, whereas it's clear that you're actually looking at the legislation, and it would be useful if the communication could come back to the constituents or the voters.
That's really good insight to get the information out to residents about what we know is coming, because we're tracking it. We get updated throughout the legislative session. The league does an end of session report that highlights all of the things that are coming to us, so we can absolutely work with our community outreach coordinator to be including some highlights on.
Yeah, and I think you have really good web pages, and I look at the web pages for all sorts of things, and it would be good to have maybe legislative highlights, how they may affect you. Then people will talk to their counselor and ask them, what are you doing?
Thank you. That's a really great suggestion.
Yeah.
Just very quick, Aaron, can you send the draft letter around in an editable format, like a Word document, so that for the next meeting we can, it's easier to type up suggestions?
Yeah, actually, we could just quickly talk about just the process. That'd be great. So yeah, just so everyone's clear, I was happy to put together some of my initial thoughts and kind of based off of last year's Budget Review Committee memo that was passed around tonight. That's going to be included in the background material and all that for the public. But yes, if you could send it around in Word format, and that would allow the committee members to make changes, edits, additions, and then would they send it to you? And how do we want to handle that?
Yeah, I think that, we'll absolutely post what you prepared as additional materials, and we can get a Word version of that to all the committee members so that they can provide feedback directly to the document. Yes, I would suggest that comes directly back to Jenny and myself, and then we will, similar to kind of the questions that came in for tonight's meeting, post those all as additional materials, and then the committee can speak about those next meeting. The next Wednesday's meeting is really for the committee to kind of work through their recommendations for this letter to council.
I have some prepared things myself. I just didn't want to ramble.
No. Do we want? I'm happy to be here for a while if we want to start having some initial discussion on some of your ideas and your ideas and my ideas. So I'm happy to do that if the committee is.
So from a practical point, something would come to you, you would send it to us. If it's in a Word document, we could use track changes, so as then you would know who said what, and then finally that would go back to Brian, I guess, from you.
Well, we have to be mindful of the Brown Act. So
That's what I
right
mean.
now, we have
We
to
don't do
either
it.
work on it now, or we adjourn and send everything to them, and then
Then it
they
goes to
compile it, and then next Wednesday is a working meeting at a public forum, so that we're not, daisy chaining it or whatever.
That's what I meant. So we would have to work on it.
Yeah,
And it
so,
would go back, 4 copies would go back.
right, so we could work on it now,
Okay,
if the committee wants to, or we
I
can
think-
adjourn and then send our thoughts to Aaron.
That's what I would suggest, and I think we
I
can
agree.
certainly tonight at least work through maybe that intro and summary and kind of how it's all framed in
Right.
general. And then as far as the specific items, maybe that's where we do that more on our own when we could put some time into it and digest some of what we learned tonight. Peter, did you have anything?
I was gonna say that it's, if we take a short recess now, come back in a little bit, do some initial work. So it's sort of doing both. It's not like
Great.
an either or.
Right.
Sounds good to me. Then we'll take a 10 to 15-minute recess
Okay, sounds
at
good.
this point. Thank you.
Yeah, and let me just clarify that this 10 to 15-minute recess will not be actual work amongst the committee members. They were on their own reading and digesting the information that was presented. Any discussion that takes place about that will be when the meeting is back live.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, it's been 10 minutes. If everyone's had time to review the ideas, then we'll reconvene. So this meeting is back in order. One thing I was just thinking about on the expenditure section. So I guess I should say, I laid it out where we have an introduction, kind of generally talk about what the city's been through over the last year, and I have to address retrenchment because that was such a big part of last year's budget and affects what's going on this year with adding some of that, restoring some of those staff and whatnot. So that's kind of laid out in the introduction for the average member of the public. City council obviously reads this as they review the budget. So wanted to set that tone, and then we go into a summary of the budget with an overview and specifically expenditures. Just my perspective is, our revenue is what it is. Depending on the economy and sales tax and all that stuff, I think expenditures are obviously something that the city has some more direct, immediate control over. So that's why it got a little bit more of a focus. And then I talk a lot about pensions because as we discussed tonight, I think it's a huge driver of cost. One thing I would like to include in that section where we talk about pensions, Aaron, do you happen to know what the pension bill is for the city this year?
the actual bill we won't get for, another month or so, but I can tell you what we've budgeted for that. So in total, it's about $6.4 million. And that's comprised again of a normal cost, which is, what we pay regardless, because we're part of the pension plan. That's about 2.2 million. Well, actually about 2.1 million. Then the unfunded liability portion is about $4.3 million. Again, we won't know the actual bill, for another month, but that's what we have budgeted based on the latest actuarial information we have.
Wow, okay, thank you. I'll turn it over to the committee, for your thoughts, and feel free to edit away, won't be offended if we want to strike a whole section or reorganize it or anything, so go for it.
If you'd like, I could read my general statement that I wrote.
Is there a way we can get that as, also a document, like a Word document too?
Me?
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll send my
Aaron.
stuff to Aaron,
yeah.
and then he can forward it to everybody. I just wrote a few things. Given the budgetary restraints of which our city operates, I'd like to note that the City of Poway staff and elected officials have continued to make concerted efforts to be mindful of revenues and expenditures year over year. During times of adversity, like many communities have faced over the last 14 months, Poway has worked diligently to reduce expenditures with retrenchment efforts in order to balance the budget during these difficult times and reduce revenues. As I look through past budgets and the proposed fiscal year 21-22 budget, Poway continues to maintain, in most instances, annual revenue surplus, which alleviate the pressures the city faces during times of recession. However, the general fund long-term forecasts show many years of deficits on the horizon, which have only been alleviated through one-time sales of property, federal fiscal stimulus, and revenue surplus from previous years. It is not advisable to continue to run a deficit with the only solutions being selling property or federal funding bailouts. This is not wise long-term planning. However, I commend our city for having the foresight to alleviate upcoming problems by continuing to develop underutilized properties like the Poway Road Improvement Project and Poway Road Housing to increase city revenues in the coming years. With the continued development of housing projects throughout the cities, these future property tax and sales tax revenue increases appear to improve future general fund deficits starting in 2026. It's kind of like a general. And then I have like the readability section. Yeah, and then I go into detail in some of these other sections.
I like addressing the long-term stuff that you discussed. That would be a great improvement.
Yeah, I think an important point that Daniel made is that the budget is being balanced on money from the federal government, and that doesn't come across. I mean, no disrespect, Brian, but it doesn't come across in the summary. But I think that's really important that people understand that this is a one-off, or maybe a two-off. I don't know to say. But then another thing in the introduction, I think it would be appropriate to say how the city staff operated under these pandemic conditions. I don't think we bring that out there, because I think they did a phenomenal job. And then, since there was a lot of, from what I understand, Facebook and people wrote in about how the committee was appointed, I think it would be appropriate to say up front something about that. And I think I wrote something about that. And if you want to paraphrase what I said, I think that is really important, because there's a lot of people out there think that are disappointed with how the committee is appointed. They don't understand the need to have expertise carry over year. And I think it would be true to say that everyone in this room appreciates that and sees that as a necessity, especially when we're actually looking at pretty tough budget conditions. So I mean, address that up front, because people were complaining.
And I think when you put it in last year's memorandum, I think that language of just saying what happened and why it happened is actually pretty good language.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot of assumptions if you listen to the street of what is going on and how things are appointed and that kind of thing, which I don't find to be necessarily true.
No, I think the reality is a lot different, and the reality is that we want to have an efficient organization that, you know, does the best for Poway. It's not self-serving in any way.
Of which the charter, you know, was amended and could be amended further for improvement, because that's the
Yeah.
goal.
Yeah.
For further improvement.
Yeah.
Great. These are great recommendations.
I also did a section on like the economic impact. I took a lot of the talking points from your presentation, Erin, and then I did make some recommendations that I don't know if they're legal or if even possible, to be honest.
Well, you're not a lawyer, so, you know. no one can hold
I'm
you
a
to it.
money person, that's all I know. But one of the things that I kind of looked at is, you know, now we've been through 2 recessions in the last 20 years, and what are those real historical impacts on revenue? Because at the end of the day, most of the costs in the budget, we can't really control. That's not the things that are within our control to change, it's the revenue. And then with the money coming in the door, how do we be mindful of those dollars and continue to be good stewards like Poway has done to set aside dollars in an effective manner? And so I thought of looking at the great financial crisis sales tax revenue changes, because one thing that you had mentioned, Erin, was that the property tax revenue tends to be more stable, whereas the sales tax revenue is economically sensitive, which totally makes sense. And so that means that when our national, local, state economic situation changes, then we are going to see major changes to the revenue streams. And one of the things that I was looking at was, given the fact that the sales tax revenue is more economically sensitive, whether during times of recession or even growth. You know, I look at this for some of my, you know, commission-based clients, that when business is booming and we're making hay while the sun is shining, okay, now we save more. And we can't assume that it's gonna continue to run at that pace, right? And so I put in, and again, I don't even know if this is legal, given current economic outlook, moving into a recovery cycle and an early stage growth cycle, now would be ideal to implement prudent revenue measures. It's my recommendation for the city to maintain a percentage buffer on sales tax revenues during times of national economic growth cycles to compensate for times of economic recession or corrections. Again, I don't know if this is legal. For example, during the Great Financial Crisis of 2008 to 2009, the city of Poway sales tax revenue fell 17% year over year. I recommend the city allocate 5 to 20% of annual sales tax revenues during early to late growth cycles for years of negative economic impact, like we saw in the Great Financial Crisis or COVID-19 recession.
That's basically a rainy day fund.
Right, which I'm sure
The
we're
state-
already doing, but I didn't
have
know
that.
if maybe we can recommend like a policy to implement.
I think that's the volatility fund.
So those are great observations. Two comments on that. One, when we were trying to understand kind of the boundaries at the early stages of the pandemic of what
Right.
might happen economically, we did look back and do research into the Great Recession, how that impacted Poway, to understand, you know, if we're looking at this type of economic event, what will that do to our revenue stream? And that gives us guidance on how we would potentially mitigate that on the expense side of things. So that's fantastic observation there. And the second is your idea of, you know, saving in the good economic years is very consistent with the general fund reserve policy.
Okay.
A number of years ago, I think it was around somewhere between 2015 and 2018,
Was that 45%?
GFOA,
Yeah.
which is came out and did that risk-based reserve analysis, and part of what they looked at was exactly what you're talking about.
Right.
And so they gave us a number of categories: the revenue volatility, expenditure volatility, and the extreme events. And kind of the sizing they did was based on that analysis. So.
And so I'm glad you brought that up, because I did look at that legislation to see what really the policy was and how it's been implemented. And I still don't quite understand fully. It sounds like we have to set aside 45% of the general fund expenditures. So if we're going to make 100 million and we're going to spend 50 million, we've got to set aside 45% of 50 million.
We need to maintain a level equal to 45% of whatever the year's operating expenses are.
Okay.
So if, so basically we're always adjusting off of that level up or down. So it's not like we're setting aside 45 million in a year. We're setting aside, like in this year, I think it was around $700,000
Okay.
to maintain that 45% level to operating expenditures.
Because when I looked at the operating expenditures, and so total, and maybe I added the SIPs into this, total expenditures for 21-22 are projected to be 51 million. So if I take 45 million of that, we need 23 million allocated, right?
So, yes, that's a very good observation. So.
And so we have in the does it go in the revenue volatility fund? Because there's almost 5.
So it's split amongst the 3 different sources. The 3 comprise the 45%.
Okay.
I don't remember the percentages off the top of my head, but what you've picked up on is something that we do so that we're not double dipping when we do that calculation.
Okay.
The capital replacement charges are they're shown in the operating expenses, and that's effectively a type of reserve, right? We're setting aside money in anticipation of a future event. So when we're doing that calculation, we're removing those numbers out of it
Okay.
before calculating the 45%. That's the discrepancy
Okay.
you picked up on.
Okay.
I think that the city does have a reasonable amount of control on our major expenses, which are personnel costs. And I think this is in terms of hiring new people. And I understand that you do give a great deal of thought into how to hire people, how many to hire, and with the understanding that if you don't hire some people, because it is a lean organization, that services will be cut or will not be maintained at a particular level. But I would strongly encourage the city to consider that the cities can't do everything. They have to be focused on very core activities, and some things, if we just can't do it, then we just can't do it if there aren't people to it, because the retirement costs that we have are really are out of our control, and they're really high. But that's I guess something that the council will have to decide on how they want to move the city. I would like to make a suggestion on the Pcpa component of the document.
Yeah.
I think it can be a little bit more general. I might suggest some text similar to this, which says PUSD negotiations were not fruitful. Therefore, a combination of decreased subsidies and external funding partnerships should be pursued. Perhaps increasing flexibility of our partners to set their prices and tracking. I think it's very important to track some of their, say, occupancy metrics in this particular case, and explore possibly looking into a third-party management company if the current management company is not able to bring the revenue streams of the Pcpa closer to cost neutral. I think it's very clear, and I don't think anybody's saying that this facility or many other facilities that are of a community benefit have to be, zeroed out in cost. but the PCPA stands out amongst basically all of the other community services that the city provides. It is a significant outlier, and it just needs to bring its revenue stream up high enough that it's not this giant red flag or in the budget.
And I wonder if we, really wait to finalize that section of our recommendations when we get more information next Tuesday on that endowment for the PCPA that Aaron had mentioned for the McCarthy endowment. Because if we anticipate getting, funding for that, which is not obviously allocated in the budget because it hasn't been finalized or anything like that, that would highlight fixing that problem.
Yeah, I think it would be covered under external funding partnerships should be pursued.
I think that component may be a little further down the road because the way the contribution is structured is initially that feasibility study, which I think we're anticipating will take 3 to 4 months.
Okay.
And then following that, the feasibility study will go to the McCarthy Family Foundation Board for approval. And following their approval, they would contribute to the endowment. I think their vision is that's the seed money for a much larger endowment and part of the feasibility study. And to Nick's question earlier, the big companies is getting those big companies in to get a much bigger endowment so that eventually we can get interest off of that, and that can help offset our operating expenses at the PCPA. But I think that's going to take a little time, I think, sorry, I keep forgetting my videos off. The booking service that I think Brian mentioned in here, I think maybe to clarify what I think you're looking for, Peter. So right now, the facility is managed by the city. We have a contract with Poway On Stage, who essentially serves as, I'll call them a booking agent. That's not how the agreement reads, but essentially when you see the Broadway show series at the PCPA, they're the ones that are booking those artists and managing those performances. One of the components of the direction from council was to potentially look at alternative booking arrangements where we potentially solicit proposals from other entities that do work like that. And is there potentially a different relationship we could have with either Poway On Stage submitting a proposal that looks different than how we're structured today, or another company submitting a proposal to us? I think we're hoping as part of some of this, we see some type of a revenue sharing agreement, because I think that is another challenge we currently have at the PCPA, is that other than facility rental fees and staffing fees, we don't really see a benefit from how any of the shows perform at the PCPA. So is there an opportunity there? So that will be a component of what we're looking at in the alternative booking services that Brian had mentioned in this staff report. Is that staff report? That's my brain.
Yeah. I'll put some edits. We'll see.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Is it possible at all to have several different booking agents utilizing one facility where you block out time, or is that just juggling chainsaws?
It's possible. One of the things we are looking at is our calendaring process, because we have many different user groups that use the facility, and I think I see some of them that are listening in tonight, because we have dates that are booked for the professional performance series, and then we have dates that our community user groups use. And the user groups are interested in having a little more flexibility with the calendar and earlier access. So I think it will be challenging, I think, just to manage one booking agent and them to be able to book, if it's Poway On Stage or someone else, them to be able to book those higher tier performers that are going to bring in revenue while still having dates set aside for our community user groups, which I think is really important to council, is that we're sharing that facility. And we have the professional series, we have the user groups, and we also have Poway Unified School District, who uses the fees too. So I think getting too many more players in there,
might be hard.
Trying to manage the calendar could be challenging, but I think we definitely want to explore what other options are out in the universe, and potentially also how we could partner differently with Poway On Stage than we do today. So we have a lot of different moving pieces to this. There's also a fee component that I think Brian mentioned. So we're going to be looking at the fees at the facility, looking at new agreements, looking at different booking options, and also looking at best practices at other theaters that we could potentially incorporate into our structure. And council also wanted us to look at how we can potentially be open more days of the year and set fees so that that's financially beneficial. One of the challenges we talked to council about is right now, our fees aren't set up at a high enough cost recovery that if we open the door, we're necessarily recovering everything
Right.
it's costing us to open the door.
Right.
So I'm actually excited to report out on Pcpa this year because it's been a topic of discussion every year. And I think council gave direction on a number of different strategies that we're working on to try to address the challenges going forward. It will take us a little time because we've got a lot of things we're working on right now, but I think looking toward the future, we really are trying to reduce that overall subsidy. But I think to Peter's point, council recognizes we're not going to get to a zero-sum game. It is a performing arts center, but can we reduce it to a number that is more manageable and, to your point, maybe doesn't stand out as much as other components of the budget?
Great.
Just one more thing I'd like to see in the Development Services Department section, some components about performance metrics on how quick their turnaround times are. I think I've seen this on the City of San Diego's website on their building department, about like what fraction of permits are cleared within some period of time. And that could be published, and perhaps internally some metrics on what things are potentially holding up development services, so that so sometimes you hear the council saying we need to streamline things, we need to make things easier for people to build. I agree with that. I think that is generally what people want to see. But if without these types of performance, or it'd be helpful if we had additional performance metrics to give specific direction, or allow them to give specific direction on how to change the regulations as they can.
Great.
Thank you.
Any other initial thoughts or edits tonight? All right, so if I heard everyone correctly, some initial thoughts are to in the opening, to talk about more of a long-term view. I think that was great. And actually, on your great point about the budget being balanced with stimulus money, I mean, Aaron, do you want to address that broad issue of, I mean, is that fair? I don't know, Nick, do you want to kind of talk a little bit about your thoughts on that? I'd like to get clarity.
So my thoughts there were a few, sorry, all tangled up here. If you look at the bar graphs of, you know, the financial health of the city, the next 2 years looks really good. Then it looks as though there's a rough period. I think it's important for folks not in this room, but outside this room, to understand that we've been through a rough period because of COVID. There's some special circumstances now that allow us to have some breathing space, but it's really perhaps only postponing some very from hard decisions down the road.
And I think more specifically, I mean, I think your comment was that this year's budget is balanced on stimulus funds. Is that?
Yeah.
I mean, can we just talk about that for a second? Aaron, could you respond?
Yeah, absolutely. And that yes, if you do the math and remove out our estimates based on the Treasury's projections, we would be showing a deficit currently with the proposed budget. So the American Recovery Plan funds are absolutely being used to help stabilize the budget, which is consistent with, you know, kind of the Fed's whole, you know, part of their whole point in dispersing this money to states. It was to help with things like revenue replacement that had revenues not, you know, dipped, we might have been in a different circumstance right now. So.
And I think that kind of goes to the point that I had made, that it seems like the council had forethought that, you know, we're kind of going into this increasing expenditures, stagnant revenue environment. And one of the ways to compensate for that is things like the Mickey Cafagna in their community center and the Poway Road and the Pomerado Road, you know, where we're increasing property taxes and sales tax revenues. Whether you like it or not, that's what the elected officials, I think, had intended. And I think that seems to show in the forecast. That's when we're going to start seeing the recuperation of those sales tax and property tax increases. I also wanted to ask you, Erin, do you, I saw in your forecasting with the increasing in property tax revenues, it seems to have increased from 2.4% to 4.2%. And can you tell me a little bit why that increased quite greatly?
Yeah, that's really driven by two things. One is a number of forecasting houses, UCLA, Anderson's economic school is one of them, are suggesting that property tax growth that we've been seeing is going to increase, and so that's part of what's driving it, along with Poway's specific development assumptions about when some projects are coming online,
Okay,
along with changes in the turnover in home sales. We've been
Right.
getting a lot of real property transfer taxes right now,
right.
which is suggesting a significant change in basis.
And do you track actuals of those transactions in the forecasting model that you have?
Can you clarify what you mean by actuals?
So, for example, you know, we could look at real estate market, and it's an economic environment that has ups and downs, and currently prices are increasing, but inventory is low. And so we might not be seeing lots of transactions, but they're greater value transactions, which again, you know, because we're capped on the increases of how much we can start year over year increasing people's property taxes. But when you make those transaction changes, when somebody that owned a home that was $200,000 in property tax now just got sold for $800,000, and so now they're paying that property tax percentage on $800,000. And so is that kind of built into that forecasting?
So the concept is the data is not that
Okay.
granular.
Okay,
There's an ability to get that data and do it, but that's one of those like down the road things because, you know, under legislation from the 70s, you
Right.
know, the
Right.
2% cap. So yeah, that turnover is very important. So the real property transfer taxes that we're getting is an indication, like the volume of those,
right.
about how, you know, and you're going to have like a $800,000 home turning over for $850, let's say. So we're not going to really see any difference there. But the greater the volume, because Poway is generally an older community,
Right.
the more likely what we're seeing is those $100,000 bases being turned into $800,000 bases. So that's part of what it's a bit of a qualitative, you know.
Right. And then I also just wanted to ask, did you look at any possible impacts of the mortgage forbearance legislation during COVID-19 and possible impacts that might have on our revenues?
From a macro perspective, yes, and it was really, it caused a disruption in that particular supply chain. So the kind of mortgage industry, you know, if people stop paying, is that going to cause impacts to banks? That's going to impact their balance sheets, which are then going to translate to the broader economy. So from a high level perspective, absolutely, but there's not an ability to take that down to some estimate of a house by house. And kind of our perceptions were at the time, one thing that kind of mitigated that potential risk, at least from my perspective, was some of the stimulus, you know, is really
Right.
geared towards helping people avoid that. And so, and it also drove up, you know, we were just talking to a bank Friday, and they were talking about how much cash they have on their balance sheet because of, the Fed's quantitative easing and all these other kind of macro policies
Right.
that have been employed that have just pumped the economy full of cash. And so we thought about it, but we didn't feel it was a material risk for this particular economic event.
I just wanted to ask, I think we would feel it if it was an impact, and obviously I don't think we really are.
Great, well, thank you. If there are no other thoughts or recommendations, I think I've got my direction here from the committee. Anything else before we go to the city manager? Yes, Aaron.
One thing, actually, the city manager asked me earlier, and I did some quick research. I should be able to take, if we send out the Word document that Brian put together and everybody kind of edits off that in a track changes mode, I believe we have the ability to merge all of those on our end back into one single document so that then, that can be used, and I can, then push that back out to everybody so everybody can see everything all at once.
Wow, great.
Okay.
And I'll do my best to kind of put together the closest thing to a final document that we can have, and then next week we'll make final edits and have a memo. All right, anything else on that? Anyone? All right, city manager?
No, just another acknowledgement of your efforts and our thankfulness for it. Another long night tonight. We do sincerely appreciate all your comments, and I hope you do believe that we're sincere when we say that they're helpful for us, and we do take them seriously. So thank you for all your time and commitment to this process.
Great, thank you, and thank you for accommodating us getting here in person. I looked on the calendar, and the last time we were together as a BRC was May 22nd of 2019, I think. So great to do this. Thank you very much, city staff, for making this work. So thanks, everyone. And with that, the meeting is adjourned.